All right, well, let's get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining the Fletcher LLM and International Law Career Chat Series. We're really excited to welcome you today. And I'm going to hand things over to Professor Ian Johnstone. Thank you, Ian, for being our moderator today.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you for organizing this event, and welcome to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. My name is Ian Johnstone. I'm a professor of international law here at the Fletcher School, and I've been here since the year 2000. And before that, I worked at the United Nations, and my field of teaching and research is international organizations, concentrated on the UN, but not exclusively about the UN. And I'm delighted to be hosting this event to talk a little bit about the Fletcher School and careers that you might want to pursue when you leave the Fletcher School. And we have a couple of graduates joining us who have had some really interesting careers. And I'm going to say a little bit about each, but I want them to start by telling us in their own words what they've done since leaving the Fletcher School. So we have Cornelia Schneider, who graduated from Fletcher in the year 2006, not from the LLM program because we didn't have an LLM program at the time, but she is an international lawyer and she's on our LLM advisory board. And she's currently working for the UN in Kosovo and has had a variety of positions with UN peacekeeping missions, with the European Union, with the International Committee of the Red Cross in various parts of the world. So looking forward to her telling us a little bit about that. Margarita Akritidou graduated more recently, 2018, from the LLM program, and her years since the Fletcher School have been with the European Union, first with the European People's Party, which is the largest party in the European Parliament, and then with the European Commission, working on migration, and now working on internet regulation. So Margarita and Connie, welcome to both of you. So why don't we kick things off with you just telling us a little bit in your own words about your career since Fletcher, what you're doing now, and what you did, Connie, in your case, over the last 12 years, Margarita, just over the last couple of years. So Connie, do you want to start things?
Sure, thank you, Ian, and welcome to everybody here. I don't want to bore you too much with what I've done, but I think Ian gave a really, impression of the fact that my career has been quite diverse. So after leaving Fletcher, and perhaps let me say that I was in private practice before Fletcher, so I made a bit of a move. I think I spanned the whole nexus from humanitarian to development to peacekeeping. I worked in Chad, I worked all over Eastern Africa and in Afghanistan, a little bit in academia, and now I'm with the UN in Kosovo. I'll tell you a bit more about that later, but I think the thing to remember about me is it's not been a straight line for me. I've really done a bit of a beeline across various sectors, which is probably quite symptomatic of Fletcher graduates.
Thank you, Connie. And I should add that in addition to Connie's career, she's also done some really interesting extracurricular work. And it was partly based on that, as well as her career, that she was awarded the Fletcher Women's Leadership Award several years ago. And she might want to talk a little bit at some point about the work she's done in Afghanistan with that school for girls there. Margarita.
Hello everyone, thanks Lucia for organizing this event today and giving us the opportunity to be here with you. It's a strange feeling to be sitting on the other side of our virtual panel, sharing my story with current and prospective students, let alone if I recall that it's only 2 years ago that I was desperately looking for others' alumni stories. It's not such a long time. Of course, I don't have so many moves that Cornelia has gone through. After Fletcher, I started an internship at the European Parliament for 4 months. And at the end of my internship, I had another one, this time at the European Commission. And since then, I've been working for 2 different directors general. Firstly on migration, and security, and now for DG General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology, designing and implementing policies to make internet a better and safer place for children. I'm really thrilled about our discussion today, so looking forward to your questions as well.
So two years in the European Commission approximately. First migration, now cyber issues, so really central issues for the European Union and for the management of international affairs. So great to have both of you here. So let's just say both, Connie mentioned that she began, before Fletcher she was in private practice, Margarita the same thing. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the career shift you've made from private practice, now working for international organizations, the UN, European Union. Did you intend that career shift when you went to Fletcher? Was that part of your motivation, or sort of how did that come about from the private sector to the public sector? Connie?
That's a resounding yes for me, Ian. It definitely was well, it was the main reason why I came to Fletcher. I worked in private practice for a few years. I think a lot of lawyers in my position that I've spoken with at Fletcher and similar organizations perhaps, feel that sort of sense of, where am I going with this? They have a sense of purpose that they want to pursue, and they maybe don't get it in private practice. So I had this vague idea, but I didn't know what to do about it. And Fletcher for me was for sure the stepping stone towards making that change. I had for several years applied to places, to internships even, and I never got anywhere. They just said, well, you don't have experience, and it's the chicken and the egg. They say in order to have experience, you need experience. And so I couldn't get off that catch-22 situation, and that was very clearly for me why I wanted to do my master's at Fletcher. I should perhaps say also, I didn't know 100% what I wanted to do. I had done an internship at one of the tribunals, the Yugoslavia tribunal. Obviously, I was thinking, okay, law and something with international organizations would be great, but it's such a wide world out there, and sort of being able to get guidance on what's out there, I think that was for me the main reason to go to Fletcher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Connie, you're a German citizen. Did you practice in Germany, or was it in the UK before Fletcher?
That's correct. I'm a German English solicitor. So yes, German, but I already had that little element of internationality, yes.
Got it. And Margarita is from Greece, and you practice in Greece, correct, Margarita, before Fletcher?
Exactly. Before Fletcher, I was working in a small private law firm, practiced civil and public law in Greece with my father. However, I always wanted to be a citizen of the world, and Fletcher enabled me to do so. During my undergraduate studies, I had an internship at the UN in New York, and most of my colleagues were Fletcher alumni. So what I could say for Fletcher is that if I put my previous experience to dots, I think that what Fletcher does to me is to connect them. Fletcher helps to connect them and make sense of them. It enabled me to understand how to connect my dots, and most importantly, to understand who I am. So I would definitely say that one of the reasons that I applied for Fletcher was my goal to build a career in international affairs, and I never regret it so.
Yeah, so that's, and we're talking to you mainly about the LLM program at Fletcher, which is our one-year Masters of Law, but the school is the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We have many students who are interested in studying law who are not necessarily in the LLM program. But of course, it's a graduate school of international affairs. So whether it's the LLM program or other degree programs, you're situated in an interdisciplinary school. So a big part of what Fletcher offers to law students or students interested in international law is to understand international law in a broader political, economic context. And so I think for the sort of career moves that you have made, the shift you've made Fletcher is really a great place for that, because it kind of takes you out of the sort of more narrow legal world into the broader world of international affairs, even if you're continuing to work in purely legal positions. And I should say, and we'll come back to this later, but Margarita's work has been in legal positions primarily. Connie's has been partly legal, partly non-legal, and some kind of combining them. Just maybe say a little more before we get to how Fletcher has helped you in your current positions, a little more about what you did when you were at Fletcher, and what was most meaningful for you about the experience there, whether it was what you were studying or the people you were interacting with, or the opportunities that you discovered that you weren't expecting. Maybe Margarita, should we start with you this time? Just say a little more about what you valued from your year at the Fletcher School.
It's a difficult question. I would definitely say the interdisciplinary approach that Fletcher follows. I was following an LLM program, taking classes also on communications and economics. The broad course offerings helped me understand the international law in a more social, economic, and political context. And it proved to be a big asset for me when I applied for jobs in the European institutions, that the boundaries between law and policy are a bit blurred. I don't know if I should go a bit more on details and say a few things about the courses I followed by Fletcher.
Yeah.
I would definitely say your classes, although I might not sound too objective, as I know that you're listening to me right now. However,
Okay.
International organizations and actors in global governance give me a great opportunity to deep into the designing of regional and international organizations, reflect on what has worked so far, what could be further improved. And they were both very interesting classes, and also the processes of international negotiations with Professor Pabit was another very stimulating and interactive class that helps you to build a skill that you can apply everywhere in your future career, ranging from negotiating your salary to negotiating international climate agreements, for instance. And of course, the sense of community that Fletcher creates. You feel like being part of a Fletcher family, of a bigger family, and everyone is there for you to help you and support you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Connie, for you it was 14 years ago, so maybe you've forgotten.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. I was actually going to say, if you'll forgive me, Ian, I will actually say for me it was not the classes that were the standout things. They were definitely what brought me to Fletcher, and they are what sort of, projected me forward, because obviously that's what you have to show on your CV, etc. But the environment that you have in Fletcher was really the outstanding thing for me. And I think definitely what makes it different from other grad schools that I've heard other people talk about, where it's a lot more disparate, let's say, you don't have that kind of community as much, which really was the difference for me at Fletcher. But in terms of what I studied, I would say, I remember this very clearly, and I think, again, this is what a lot of lawyers face. If you want to graduate as a lawyer or qualify as a lawyer in your jurisdiction, you're often forced to follow a very streamlined program. So, they tell you what you have to study, because that is part of what you need to do to get your qualification. And I felt that was really too restrictive for me. And so when I came to Fletcher, I had this massive thirst almost to say, oh my God, here I can finally do whatever piques my interest. And so, I studied Arabic. I did some Southeast Asia classes. I did the class on peacekeeping with you, which was fantastic and really led me into a certain direction. I was also an editor on the Fletcher Forum, and this breadth of experience that you get at Fletcher, that really is what stands out to me, rather than one particular class.
Yeah. Yep, good. Thank you both. I see that there are already some questions coming from the participants, and we're definitely going to give you a chance to ask those questions. I'm going to sort of engage in a bit more of a conversation here and tell you a little bit about the courses I teach, which were mentioned. But please, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box, and Lucia is going to be monitoring that, and at a certain point we'll open it up and start pulling out some of those questions and turning them over to the panelists. But just maybe briefly, some of the courses that I teach and how they relate to careers in international organizations. So I teach I guess we can call it an introductory course to international organizations called International Organizations. I teach a course in peace operations. I teach a course that Margarita mentioned, Actors in Global Governance. And I teach a course called Non-Proliferation Law and Institutions. And the thread that runs through all of those courses is the interaction between international law and international politics. So, you know, if there's one question that I'm constantly trying to answer in the research I do and in the teaching I do, is how does international law impact international politics? And so the courses on international organizations aren't so much about, you know, what are the organizations, what do they look like, or what's the law of the organization, but more what do the organizations do and how do they do it, and to what extent do legal issues impact what they do and how they do it. And they all have a sort of orientation towards reform. So the Actors in Global Governance course that Margarita mentioned, the way that that's structured is students choose an institution, an international organization. It could be an intergovernmental organization like the UN or the European Union or the World Trade Organization, or it could be a non-governmental organization, or it could be a network of organizations. But they choose an institution and essentially present to the class and write a report on the institution, a stock-taking report, how well is it done, and a vision for the future. And the rest of the class is constituted as a senior management group for the organization. So it's basically a way of looking closely at a particular institution, thinking about what its function is and how well it functions in the current international climate, and thinking about what reforms would be necessary to make it better. So, you know, right away you're sort of engaged in legal and political analysis, but all with this sort of policy orientation. And I think you're going to discover that a lot of the courses at Fletcher are like that. It's an analysis of what's going on in the world, and then, you know, forcing students to be thinking about, all right, how can whatever is going on be changed, improved, done better, and how can I situate myself in that? And I teach the international organizations courses, but there are many other faculty members who teach courses that have an international organizations component to them, or teach skills or knowledge that are useful for jobs in international organizations. So I think you'll discover that you can sort of look across the whole curriculum and pick and choose. If your interest is migration, you know, taking courses in migration or in development or in humanitarian action, where you're going to be getting bits and pieces of information which will be really useful if you're looking for a job with UNHCR, the International Organization for Migration, and you get to construct it yourself. And then maybe the one other thing, because I don't want to go on too much longer here, but we have at the Fletcher School what's called a capstone or a thesis project. And every student essentially writes a large paper, either in the form of an academic style thesis or a policy paper, that becomes, in a sense, the sort of synthesis and culmination, ideally, of what they've learned at Fletcher. And that becomes a way for you to really dig deeply into something that interests you, developing real expertise in that, and then using that to go off and try to get a job that might draw upon that. So we talk about it as a calling card. You use that as a way of saying, listen, I know an awful lot about something, and that something may be a particular international institution or a particular functional area where you want to get a job at an institution. So it's a way for you to dig really deeply into something and develop the expertise that you want, that you don't necessarily get from the courses, but you kind of pull them all together yourself. So that's briefly that, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But before we open it up, and we've got a bit more time, I just want to go back to Connie and to Margarita, and just to say a little bit more about what you're what you're doing and what you've done in your careers, and how the Fletcher education helped you, whether it's, you know, something you learned at the school or the people you met. And, you know, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be a broad sweeping, it may just be anecdotes, you know, particular moments when you were able to draw on something. Just to give people a bit of a flavor of how what you learn at Fletcher is hopefully applicable in the real world, in the world in which you're working right now. Connie, can you start on that one?
Sure, gladly. I would say definitely the network. I mean, you know, we talk about the Fletcher Mafia, and it's been 14 years, as you said, and that is true. The Fletcher Mafia is real, and it's existed in every place in the world that I've worked in. And as I mentioned, that includes Chad, it includes Sudan, it includes Congo, Afghanistan, Kosovo. Everywhere I have been, there have been Fletcher graduates. And I'll go further than that. My first internship with the UN was through Fletcher. And my first job at the UN was through a Fletcher contact. So I can't overstate the importance of the network that I did get through the school. I think Margarita mentioned, you know, if you go to the UN, there are always people who went to Fletcher and who understand the importance of that degree, who can, you know, commute what it means in terms of intellectual education that you received. I definitely feel that, I mean, I did 2 years at Fletcher, so that's what, I think 16 courses, if I'm not mistaken. That definitely, you know, gives me enough to pick from over the course of a diverse career. I can always go back and say, oh, actually, you know, I'm also a specialist in this. Just to give you an example, I mean, you just mentioned that I've worked a lot in legal, semi-legal positions, rule of law, etc., and I can talk more about that. But the position I'm currently in is actually called economist. It's a coordination role, but with an economist in brackets. So when I applied, I was thinking, I am much more of a lawyer than an economist. But guess what? You know, I did a lot of economic stuff at Fletcher, and so I was also able to rely on that and really push that to the fore. So I think that's one of the advantages you get from such a diverse education, that, you know, you don't have to say, oh, I am the specialist in migration, or I am the specialist in international law. You can always branch out, and it'll come back 10 years later perhaps to assist.
Yeah, great. Margarita?
I couldn't agree more with Connie. When I was at Fletcher, I remember myself feeling a bit sick of all this Fletcher Mafia story. But when I graduated, I realized how valuable this alumni network is, especially if you're looking for housing in DC, this is for sure. The fact that Fletcher is so diverse immediately decreases the possibilities of internal competition, in a sense that everyone is willing to help you finding a job. When we decided to organize our first alumni event in Brussels with my other LLM friends that we were all together, we met people working at the EU delegations, the US Embassy, at think tanks that we had no idea before. Fletcher creates this sense of community. Even if we're not studying together, to some extent we are sharing the same experiences, the same values, and there are Fletcher people everywhere. So trust Fletcher Mafia and invest in this network. And I would say that also my first internship was through Fletcher. It was a bit random. When I graduated, I was not sure what I really wanted to do. I had applied for the OPT, but at the time I was not very satisfied with the job opportunities in the States. So I decided to move to Europe, and I wanted a job that would allow me to keep updated with the developments on the other side of the Atlantic. So I was scrolling down the social list, and through the Fletcher social list, I saw this opportunity at the YPP group, Transatlantic Internship Program. And it's true that I was quite lucky because a hiring person has very good relationships with a Fletcher and always tries to pick up at least one intern from our school. So this is something also I tip for prospective students and current students to have in mind, that have a careful look at the Fletcher social list. You never know what you can find.
Yeah. So let me just pick up on a couple of points made there. First of all, the sense of community. So Fletcher is famous for that, the sense of community that develops when you're at the school, and that sense of community continuing after you leave. And it's almost a self-perpetuating phenomenon, because you hear about it, you feel it at the school, and then you feel some obligation to carry it on when you leave. So that's why so many Fletcher graduates are so responsive when they get calls from Fletcher students, because I think, well, somebody answered my call however many years ago, and I both want to do it, but feel some sense that I should do it. And it works well. It actually works well for the faculty. I mean, I can call Connie or Margarita and say, I'm trying to figure out what the EU is doing on the internet, or I don't get what's going on in Kosovo and I'm about to give a lecture on it. Can you, explain it to me? Or I can send them a message saying, somebody is really interested in a job in peacekeeping. Would you mind giving them a little advice? And I'm almost always getting positive responses. So that sense of community continues. But the other thing about it is it's partly a social thing. It's partly, we want to be good to each other. But I think there's also a truly professional dimension to this, which is if you're in a job, you're a Fletcher graduate, and you're trying to understand something, and you happen to know working for UNDP as somebody who sort of understands that best, you call them up and you say, I'm struggling with this issue, or we're putting together a working group, and who would you suggest should be part of this working group? So it works both as a social phenomenon, but also I think as a professional relationship which carries on for your whole life. And then the other thing is the value of a law degree in law jobs, but also in non-law jobs. That was my own experience at the UN. My first job at the UN was in the Office of Legal Affairs, but that was only for 1 year. After that, for the next 10 years or 8 years, it was in non-law positions. It was in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. It was in the Executive Office of the Secretary General, where having a legal background was helpful, but they were not legal positions. And I think that's important to remember if you're looking for a job in an international organization, is look for those law jobs, but don't look only for jobs that are seeking to hire lawyers. Look for jobs that, maybe seeking to hire economists, as Connie said. That one surprises me a bit, because I would have thought political, civil affairs, humanitarian, you draw on your legal background. But the fact that a job which is sort of designed for somebody with an economics background, Connie has found her way to, is really interesting. But it's a much, in the world of international organizations, a legal background is valuable across a whole range of jobs, and not necessarily those that are designed purely for lawyers. So maybe, Lucia, what do you think? Should we open it up to questions now, and then maybe we should, because I see that the Q&A is growing, and I don't want to monopolize things, and then maybe we can come back, and if I have another question or two, we can come back to those. But why don't we just open it up, and maybe you can moderate and relay the questions.
Great. So I'm going to just ask the first question. This is about pathways into international organizations, and the student asks, do you know pathways into the UN besides the Young Professionals Program, the Junior Professional Officer Program, as well as their internship program? So maybe you both, Margarita, you touched on this a bit, but you could tell us a bit about how you landed your position. If you started in an internship, how did you leverage that into a full-time job? And how do you see people starting their careers at international organizations, getting their foot in the door? And then also related to that would be, how would you recommend that students build up experiences by working for NGOs or think tanks before entering the UN, or any other advice you have for current LLB or JD students about experience you would recommend they try and get before applying for full-time jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Should I start? Okay. So I would say that starting with internship is definitely the easiest and most secure path to find a job in an international organization. I would say a few things about career paths in the European institutions. For those interested in a career at the European Union, we're quite fortunate to have a couple of different paid internships that someone can apply for. To my knowledge, every year there are 2 sessions for internship, one from March to July and another one from October to February. In this way, you can familiarize yourself with the general rules, the way decisions are taken at EU level, interests are balanced, and at the same time start building your network inside the institution, which is very crucial for your next step. And if I could say just a keyword, I think this is networking. Try to invest in this. For instance, when I moved from my internship to a real contract, I used to spend at least once per week having coffee with colleagues from different units, fishing if there are any job vacancies there, future opportunities, so that they can have my name in their mind. And when anything pops up, they think, okay, we have a colleague that she's looking for a job, so maybe this is a good match for it. And another thing that I think is also very crucial for international organization is practice your language skills, and Fletcher is the perfect place for it.
Lucia, you want me to continue?
That would be great.
Okay, where to start? I have a lot to say about this, but so clearly people are familiar with the YPP and JPO programs and so on. Let me just say this. I mean, YPP is an interesting program and so on, but it is very sort of selective, and I think over the course of my career, I've met a handful of people who entered the UN through that way. So I would say don't be disappointed if you don't get in or you're not eligible to apply. The same with JPO. I mean, those of us who are lucky enough to come from nationalities where the government supports JPO programs, it is a great way into the UN for sure, but I know that that doesn't cover everyone. So although perhaps also to bear in mind, particularly for graduates from certain African and Asian countries, I think there are countries like the Netherlands that actually support JPO programs for non-nationals. So it's always worth to look into that. I think one issue to be aware of within the UN is there's a lot less, certainly P1s. I don't remember ever seeing a P1, although I'm told in principle they exist.
Connie,
But,
just make sure not everybody will necessarily know what a P1 is, and what you mean is a sort of entry level. Yeah,
entry level.
Not everybody.
I'm sorry, you become so embroiled in it. Yes, a P1 is, well, you'd be looking at professional level careers if you graduate from Fletcher for sure. So it goes from P1 to P5 or P6, but P1 would be the entry level, or was at some stage. But just to say, you know, P1s and P2s are much less about the place these days. And that goes to the point that Margarita made about internships. I think it's very unfortunate development, but it is a development that a lot of UN institutions rely much more on interns now than they used to. So back in the days, they might have hired a P2, but with the budget restrictions and so on, nowadays a lot of them rely on interns or possibly UNVs, and I'll say something about that in a minute. So just to say that has become much more of a stepping stone into a career at the UN. UNVs, so a UN volunteer, again, I'm guessing that a lot of you are familiar with that. The concept originally wasn't necessarily designed as an entry-level position, because it was also, or it still is targeting, professionals with 20, 30 years of experience. However, in practice, it has oftentimes become an entry point for young professionals to get experience, to get that foot in the door, to get that first experience in a crisis country. You talked about, or whoever asked the question mentioned, would you encourage internships or think tanks and so on? And I would say yes. I mean, it depends on your individual circumstances, but the UN has very strict interpretations of how many years of experience you require for a certain level. So again, if you come to Fletcher and you've already got 5 years of work experience, that's probably less of a problem. But if you've only got 2, you might be borderline, and you really need to look into that or have it explained to you by someone who understands the system of what jobs are you'll be considered for given your experience already, and how you can perhaps boost your CV in that regard. I would definitely say, and again, there's so much out there, not everyone wants to go into peacekeeping, but if you want to be in peacekeeping or development or anything that involves development or conflict countries, get an experience in those countries. And it doesn't really matter where that is. That could be NGOs, it could be Red Cross societies, it could be all sorts of institutions that I did want to say something else. Ian mentioned this earlier, think outside of the box. So don't only think secretariat. Don't only look at Inspira, which is the portal that the UN uses for job applications. Look at, there's so many other websites out there, unjobs.org, or look at other agencies that might have an easier way in. For example, UNOPS, which is the operational arm of the UN and does a lot of project management, may not seem to you like that's a great start for a career in international law, but actually UNOPS does a lot of rule of law work these days. So, again, just be open to what's out there. And perhaps, if I may, two other points I wanted to make that I've written down. I always recommend to young graduates to spend a little bit of time on LinkedIn, go through profiles of people who you've come across or who you become aware of, and see where they've been. See what they've got on their CV and what steps they've taken. And, when I was going through my Fletcher years, I literally had Post-its on my wall that said, here are the 5 things I still need to get for my profile to be where I want it to be. Margarita mentioned languages, there's, the internship in a conflict country that I had to tick off my list. There'll be stepping stones like that you should look at and that you need to think about. What do I need to have in order to get to a certain place? I would also mention, I don't want to go into too much of the nitty-gritty, but if you are interested in the UN, you may have come across this idea of rosters. So you will often find in the internal, in the job announcements, you will see something that says this is a roster announcement. So that basically means it's not a job per se, but it means that if you apply and if you're successful, you'll be put on a roster. Now, that cannot be overstated. Being on a roster will be so helpful for you in the future to get a job, especially if you then have a network and have someone who's willing to give you a job. If you're able to say, I am on a roster already, that really can speed things up. It can make things a lot easier. And perhaps also to say, it is worthwhile to apply to jobs that may not be your first choice, or that may be in countries that you may not be interested in, because that is a good way to get rostered. If there's less interest in a position in Bangui than in New York, you may have bigger chances of getting rostered in Bangui, but it would still qualify you for a job in New York later on. I'll stop here.
You both covered a lot of ground. Lucia, I just want to add, I know there's a lot of questions there, but just very quickly, one point on the working with an NGO or a think tank. There are, especially in the humanitarian development, conflict, peacekeeping world, working with these organizations alongside a UN entity, a UN peace operation or a UN development operation, humanitarian can be valuable because you're actually going to be getting relevant expertise, but you're probably also going to be getting to know the people in the UN, and you're going to earn a reputation based on the work you're doing with the NGO. So it's in part the actual experience you get, and in part the opportunity to work alongside various UN entities. Lucia.
Great. All right. So another question from the audience. This was directed to you, Professor Johnstone, but I think we can call on Connie to answer it as well. Both of you mentioned that you served in legal roles, but also in non-legal roles. And can you share about how your legal training benefited you in those roles, and whether they were happy to have your legal background, or in the non-legal jobs, was that a benefit or a hindrance at all?
I'll let Connie can speak more, so I'll go first quickly. My first job was in the Office of Legal Affairs, as I mentioned, and then when I moved to the Secretary General's office, it was just essentially the function was all-purpose aid to the Secretary General. It did mean that from time to time, my legal background was called on. So there was a moment, for example, when there were questions around cooperation with the International Criminal Court in the peacekeeping world. And the fact that I had a legal background was helpful there. We had to sort of go through some of the legal questions around that kind of cooperation. So it was partly substantive knowledge. Then there's also this kind of weird and, perhaps misguided impression that the lawyers think clearly and logically and write well. And so often, they would say, can you sort of hold the pen on this report because, you're a lawyer, so you're going to be able to put it in nice, clear terms. And, I didn't disabuse anybody of that. I didn't, pretend that, this isn't a lawyer's job, because often it was this sort of interesting work. And so for me, it did make a difference, both because of the kind of thinking associated with being a lawyer and some of the substantive knowledge. But Connie, you've had a lot more diverse quasi-legal positions.
Yeah, I would say this. For me, I often thought of my law degree or my qualifications as, a hoop I had to jump through, and then I didn't use it so much anymore. So in some ways, it was like the tick box that I had to have, like you just said, Ian, the thinking that's associated with it. A lot of people say, oh, if you want to work in rule of law, you need to have a law degree, and that's a requirement. Even though I think, personally, I think you don't need to have a law degree or be a qualified lawyer to have it. I mean, I was just seeing another question where someone said, if I don't have a law degree, is that stopping me from it? And I would say the thinking goes more in the direction nowadays where people say, well, you need to be able to show this kind of thinking, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a law degree. But having said that, so in some ways, it's a tick box thing that allows you to apply for certain jobs, allows you to get certain positions because of what people expect you to be able to do. I 100% agree on the, ability to draft things, to think in certain ways, the ability to be able to find the answer, even if you don't know it. I would perhaps even say, just sort of comparing my pre-Fletcher with my post-Fletcher abilities. When I came to Fletcher, I was very good at drafting, 40, 50, 100-page long memos that you would produce for arbitrations and the kind. What I couldn't do was produce a one memo that people would actually read on a busy day. And I found that really, really difficult, because I think lawyers often have that thinking, oh, but I have to think about option B, C, D, and E, and, and then look at all the legal precedents out there. And so one thing I learned at Fletcher was to say, okay, you have that legal knowledge, you understand politically what your boss is asking you to do, the question he wants you to answer. Now combine those two things and produce that one-page memo that gives him the reassurance that you've looked at the 100-page long memo and that you know the answers, but that you actually give him what he needs in order to be able to take a decision quickly. And I think that's kind of the divergence of, you know, purely legal thinking with more of an international law / international politics thinking that you get at Fletcher.
Great. Thank you both. All right. This is a two-part question, and I'd like to start with the second part. The student asks, I've often heard from my public international law lecturers that most practitioners in international law have at least a master's, and that to get a career in public international law, you most likely would need to start out in private practice first, or in the UK context, getting a training contract. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. So, Margarita, do you want to start with, for that? You were in private practice before coming to Fletcher and going to the UN. Did you feel that that made it easier for you to transition into working at the UN? What have you seen among your colleagues who are junior in the organization like you are, and would you recommend a master's as well as working in private practice if you would?
I don't think that we should put them into boxes. The one does not exclude from the other. If you want to really pursue a career in private law, it doesn't mean that if at some point you want to switch, it's difficult. I mean, what happened in my case is that I started practicing private law. I took the skills that private law gave me and I used them for my switch to international organization. For instance, litigating before the national courts in Greece gave me the chance to feel more extroverted so that I can communicate my needs and what I wanted to do with the rest of my team. So I used these communication skills and my negotiation skills for my switch to a more international environment.
Great. And Connie, how about you? Did you feel that having that private practice experience gave you a leg up, or do you, and alternatively, do you think that it's even possible for people to start their career at an international organization, or do most people have to start in private practice and then switch?
Lucia, I'm going to give you a legal answer to that, and that's it depends, because I really think it does depend. You know, when we talk about a legal career in the UN, what is it we're talking about? If you're thinking of, you know, a career at one of the tribunals and you want to be a trial attorney there, or a prosecutor or a defense lawyer, yes, for sure you will need to have some kind of background from your own jurisdiction in that. Otherwise it's going to be very hard, not impossible, but hard. Another area I would perhaps call out is OHCHR, the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights, you know, the sort of typical human rights career that lawyers tend to take there in terms of investigators, you know, looking at special commissions of inquiry and the like. I think in those cases you can really benefit from having done private practice, you know, understanding how you litigate, how you organize large amounts of casework and so on. If we're not talking about that, perhaps less so. And again, it depends on what are you looking at. Are you looking at rule of law work, supporting police, justice institutions? You know, you might be better off having a background, having worked in a ministry somewhere in your home country, or again, as Ian mentioned, you know, with an NGO or a think tank, having looked at justice reform globally. So it's hard when you're put in that position of, do I need a master's, yes or no? There is no clear-cut answer, but I think anyone thinking about this right now, you should have some kind of idea where you want to go. You know, are you thinking of tribunals? Are you thinking of human rights work? Are you open to anything? I would perhaps just say, since the person asking the question seems to come from the UK system, as I mentioned before, so I qualified in the UK and I went to law school there, and I was quite happy to assume that that qualifies as postgraduate degrees. And that was not enough to get me through the hoop that required me to have a master's degree. So I think for me, the master's degree here really helped me shape that thinking. Where is it I want to go? It helped me tick a box when, you know, jobs asked me to have a master's degree, and it helped refine that thinking.
Great, thank you.
I want to add just one other brief perspective here, which is private practice, absolutely wonderful, but I had experienced a couple of times where people had Wall Street jobs, and after 5 or 10 years they thought, well, I've been a brilliant Wall Street lawyer, surely, you know, the UN would love to have me. And that just wasn't the case, because, you know, the experience as a corporate lawyer on Wall Street didn't translate all that well to some of the things they wanted to do. So don't assume that the experience in itself is going to open doors for you. I think if you are in private practice, and especially if you're not doing public international law, try to be doing things while you're in private practice, which will set you up for applying for a position, which isn't just, oh, well, I'm a, you know, great lawyer, surely I can help you in your work.
Great, thank you all. I'd like to go to the first part of this question. The student asks, what advice would you give to undergraduate law students, or I'll say JD students and recent graduates as well, about what they can do if they aspire to pursue a career in public international law? So what would you do if you're looking at volunteering, internships, what classes to take? What would you recommend to these people who are just at the beginning of a career in this area? Let's start with Ian.
So go to the Fletcher School. That's the first bit of advice I would give. I think I would go back to what I was saying about the thesis capstone. This is sort of from a purely academic side, and I'm gonna leave it to the others to talk a bit more about sort of professional. But find something that you really develop an interest in, and that you can develop some expertise in. To be able to say, I really understand this as well as anybody understands this, I think is helpful. Whether it's because the subject matter is important for the job you're applying for, or just because it shows that you've got the capacity to develop that kind of expertise. I'm a generalist. I think, you know, all of us are generalists, and in a way, you know, the Fletcher School encourages being a generalist. But it's also useful to say, I can think in broad strokes, but if you need somebody who can really dig deeply into something and explore it in depth and understand it in all of its intricacies, that's a valuable kind of skill and knowledge set to have. And so that would be my piece of advice, is don't just take the courses. Find something, whether it's in a thesis or through a paper you write, that you can really say, I know this as well as anybody in the world knows this, and I believe I can translate this to some other subject matter that if you hire me.
Margarita, any advice to people just starting out or still in their LLB programs?
Yeah, I will touch upon something that Connie said. I would suggest using your LinkedIn, having a look at job vacancies, start thinking of what skills you're lacking, what skills you need to build for the job that you really want. Find something that you can build expertise on it. And in my case, I tried to link my capstone with the work that I really wanted to do. So it actually worked for me. And try to find a link between the courses that you really want. Fletcher was my third LLM, so I had 2 other masters before coming to Fletcher, and I think that Fletcher was the one that made me find the link between all these dots so that I can have my career train crossing it.
And Connie, any thoughts on this question?
Well, perhaps just to reiterate what Ian said on the capstone, just by way of anecdote. So I work in Kosovo. I've been here for 2 years, and I was on the receiving end of, Fletcher students giving me calls saying, how can we get in? And just last year, we had a recent graduate who used his capstone on cultural heritage to get an internship with UNHCR here in Kosovo, because that is exactly one of the topics they're looking at, this question of how can you protect, for example, Kosovo-Serbian cultural heritage here in Kosovo. And so, yes, for sure, that's an entry point into having that conversation with people who may want to give you a job. At the very early stage, I would say I was always a very curious person. So I kind of went where things took me, where my interests took me. And it's kind of hard to predict where that will be. And Margarita talked about connecting the dots, and there's that famous Steve Jobs talk about, you can only connect the dots looking backwards. And I think that's really true. I was a lawyer. I did an internship at the ICTY. I didn't really like being a corporate lawyer, but I didn't fully know where that would take me. I went to Fletcher. I took a class in rule of law, which I never even knew existed. I had an internship in Sudan, which happened to be at the same time that the Sudanese president was indicted by the International Criminal Court, which was the very first time this happened. And guess what? There was my master's thesis, which allowed me to combine the stuff I was doing at Fletcher with my previous expertise at the ICTY and my sort of previous work as a lawyer, which then took me on to the next step. So I would just say, keep an open mind, don't close the doors, but at the same time, do think about how you market yourself. So I mean, we're kind of repeating the same themes, but I think that is because they are the prevalent themes.
Definitely. Well, it looks like we're just up against the hour, so I want to thank all of you for joining us. You've shared some super useful advice. We love your Fletcher school spirit and you taking the time out of your busy days to join us. So thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Johnstone, for agreeing to moderate this panel. I just want to introduce myself again to everybody. I'm Lucia Fuchs, the Associate Director of the LLM program here. And I know that there were a lot of questions we didn't get the chance to answer, so I'm going to drop my email in the chat. I'd love to hear from you if you are interested in our program or you want to discuss some of the questions that we didn't get to, and I'll be happy to go over admissions questions with you over email or even scheduling a Zoom together. I'll also share in the chat our social media platforms, and I would love for you all to join us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and we'll be sharing more information sessions throughout the school year. We actually have one coming up on the 23rd, Wednesday, with Professor Joel Trackman and Professor Tom Dannenbaum. That will be an information session about the program as well as Q&A with them about studying at Fletcher. So thank you again, everybody, and please feel free to reach out to us if we can answer any more questions of yours. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all. Great to see you.
Thank you all.